Kia ora, Kato. We're here from New Zealand to the world, to Mexico and the world, in this first colloquium of New Zealand and Mexican studies. We're going to start this panel on Poetic Geographies with Dr. Leonel Alvarado from Massey University and Professor Alberto Vitale from UNAM and Professor Lizbeth Campos from UNAM. We're going to start with Dr. Leonel Alvarado. He's originally from Honduras, an associate professor at Massey. He lived in the US before moving to New Zealand. He now coordinates the Spanish and the Portuguese programs here at Massey University and teaches Latin American literature, travel writing, and popular music. He has published more than 10 books of poetry, fiction, and criticism. His latest book, El lirismo patriótico centroamericano, himnos, nacionalismo e identidad, explores the relationship between music, nationalism, migration, and identity through the national anthems of Central America. Today, Leonel is going to present Portable Aotearoa, a Kiwi poet in Mexico and Central America. So welcome everybody, and welcome, Leonel.
Thank you, Celina. It's great to be here again and to keep this conversation across the Pacific going. And I'm very happy to share with you a few thoughts about New Zealand poetry, especially about a New Zealand poet who happened to go to Central America and Mexico in the 1970s, a period that was very interesting here in New Zealand. There was so much that was happening, especially in terms of not only literature, but also in terms of the role played by the indigenous culture, by Maoris here in New Zealand, and how this is reflected in the book that I'll be sharing some ideas about with you today. I should explain a bit of the title of this presentation. Aotearoa is the name that the Maoris, that all of us give to New Zealand. So it's the Maori name of New Zealand, Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud. And then Kiwis is what the New Zealanders are called, no? Not only because of the bird that is right here, but also because of the kiwi fruit that you can find in Mexico too. And wondering, one of the things about New Zealanders, and one of the things that they are known for is because they like to travel, and I'm sure we'll all resume traveling after this pandemic. So that is part of the New Zealand psyche, I think, of the New Zealand identity. But it's interesting to recognize the fact that traditionally New Zealanders will travel to Europe. So there was this European perception of New Zealand culture. And rarely they will go to places like Mexico, Central America, or Africa, for instance, or Asia. In the last decades, that changed a bit. So you will find Kiwis going to Latin America. So this talk is part of a seminar that I give on Latin American travel writing, in how the concept of Latin America was invented. It was interesting that the last panel we were talking about this invention of Mexico, the invention of culture, how cultures are invented, which is what happened through the works of many travel writers who went to what is now called Latin America. That concept didn't exist. So we're talking about the late Renaissance year, 1492, when Columbus arrived in what is now called Latin America, and what is now called America. No, in how they perceive, these travel writers perceive the people and also nature, and how that managed to shape that idea that we have about nature and people across the centuries. But the seminar also explores how the concept of travel writing evolved since the Renaissance till now. So we start with Columbus, his diary, and also the letter that he wrote to the King and Queen of Spain in 1492. And we finish with a Kiwi traveler, a woman who went to Argentina. And we also have many other travelers like Walter Raleigh, like Humboldt, for instance. Many women who went to Latin America in the 19th century too, and how they were talking about Latin American culture, about American culture at the time, about nature, about people, but also about their own cultures, about themselves, and how they were positioning themselves towards the people, or the concept of travel writing themselves, and how that encounter with the other reflected on the way that they perceive their own culture. So that is what I believe happened with the writer that I will be talking to you about. Vincenna Sullivan is a well-established writer and critic, a very prolific writer here in New Zealand. He's part of the literary canon. And he happened to go to Mexico and Central America in the 1970s. And it's very interesting that at the same time, around the same time, 1974, 75, Italo Calvino was also in Mexico. He went to Oaxaca and he wrote a beautiful, beautiful story about Mexican cuisine, and also reflects on what that experience is telling him about himself, about his own culture. And this is what happened with Vincenna Sullivan too. And I find really interesting that the back cover of the book says that the poems were written during a trip to Central America. So the concept of Mexico doesn't appear there, which is fascinating. So perhaps the idea of Latin America, even though it's still in the 1970s, was taking shape. It wasn't that clear, because as I was saying, people from Oceania would travel mostly to Europe. But O'Sullivan recognizes the importance of traveling. So he said that is the shortest cut to independent thinking. So, and then he will talk later on about his position within the literary canon, about his genealogy, his what Maori calls whakapapa. He said that his whakapapa, his genealogy, can be traced back to Europe, but it's enriched, and it's reshaped when we go to other places, when we absorb other cultures. So he wrote this book about the indigenous cultures of Mexico and Guatemala. So that's where we went in the 1970s. And I happened to come across this book, and I find it really, really interesting. So there is a poem. I have some poems here in my presentation. I won't be reading them. I just for you to have an idea. So he's talking about Holy Thursday. So he happened to go there during Easter, during Semana Santa. And that is fascinating because O'Sullivan, well, you can recognize the Irish name there. He's a Catholic writer. He's a Catholic man. And the interesting thing that he says here, that being Catholic is similar to being a Pakeha. Pakeha is the name given to people, New Zealanders who are not of Maori descent. So we have Maoris and Pakehas. When we talk about Maoris, we have to recognize the fact that there are many tribes, many iwis. There is this richness, there is in this diversity within Maoris themselves. So what happened with O'Sullivan is that he arrived in Guatemala and Mexico, and then he was confronted with this different way of approaching mythology and Catholicism. So all this conflating, because these two types of mythologies came together, and he he says seems like he witnesses how Easter, how Semana Santa is celebrated in Latin America, particularly in some countries, with this coming together of these two mythologies, Catholicism and the indigenous culture. And he says this is the way Easter should be, because he doesn't see that here in New Zealand. And we who live here in New Zealand, we experience the same thing too. So he sees this rich Baroque celebration, this Baroque culture. So he goes to churches, but he sees that religion lives outside the church, not only within the institution, but it's also part of daily life. In not only religion, but also mythology, but also the way that people perceive the world. So, so he confronts this Mesoamerican, the Mayan and Aztec mythology with Maori, and he sees that there are connections, but there is something there that I find really, really interesting too. The fact that in the 1970s, there was so much happening. Oh, let me go back to it because this I find very interesting. He says that he's thinking about New Zealand. He's thinking about that country facing the world without myth. I find those two verses really, really interesting. Why without myth? When you have Maori mythology that is so important, prevalent, that is essential to the New Zealand identity. Why without mythology? And so we have to trace back what was happening during the 20th century in New Zealand in terms of race relations, for instance, in terms of the place occupied by Maoris in New Zealand culture. What was New Zealand culture at the time? So it is, in a way, troubling to see that he's talking about that there is no myth here in New Zealand when the opposite was happening. But there was a great deal of politics behind that. So he refers more to the idea of this altar of wool, for instance. No, New Zealand was known more so at the time for this production, of wool by ships. There were 40 million, 50 million ships for a long time here in New Zealand, not anymore. But why is that? Why deny this essential part of New Zealand identity when in the 70s there was so much happening? What took place in the 70s, I'm not an expert on Maori history and culture. I feel like a fake talking about this, but it's just to start this conversation. It was the period of what is called the Maori Renaissance, when the way that Maoris had been treated and the way that Maori had been positioned within New Zealand society was questioned. And we are now in the 21st century reaping the benefits of what happened in the 70s. For instance, I'm sure you all know that the national sport here in New Zealand is rugby. But at the time, even though there were rugby players, there were Maori players. No? When they had to tour South Africa. South Africa was during the apartheid. South Africa wouldn't accept Maori players touring the country, touring South Africa, or going there to play because they were not white. In order for them to go and play, they had to be branded as honorary whites. No, they had to they had to be whitened. Otherwise, they wouldn't be let into the country. No. So that sparked a great deal of protest, and there was a massive protest later on in 1981, for instance, when South Africa toured New Zealand. And then there was also in the 70s a great deal of activism towards the legal rights of Maoris. No, in 1840, the British Crown and many Maori tribes, many Maori Kiwis, Iwis signed what is called the Waitangi Treaty, because it was set in a place called Waitangi. And that treaty, it was had the purpose of establishing a different type of an accord, different relationship with the crown, and that led in the 70s to the establishment of the Waitangi Tribunal that will deal with issues, legal issues pertaining to land ownership, for instance, and to compensation because of the land that was stolen at the time, no, during the colonial period. And then the Race Relations Act that established that no people should be discriminated because of ethnic origin. And also Maori writers started to publish. There was the first Maori collection of short stories, Ponamu Ponamu, which is jade, greenstone, hade. And Maori started to be taught in schools. The Kohangareo system was established. Good. And then why is this book in a way skewing that? So I find that a very interesting conversation. And also O'Sullivan goes back in his book about some of the tropes of travel writing. For instance, there is when he goes out into the street and he realizes that he's also no more than a tourist. No, he said that he feels at ease next to that lady who went there from Detroit to take pictures, not to snap pictures. And that is very common in travel writing after mass tourism, after World War II. And also how the presenter, the traveler positions himself. And this happened throughout the colonial period. Writers will position themselves on top of a mountain and will describe. They will have this vertical view of the place, of the landscape, and also of the people. The othering of the people took place from a position of privilege. What is called the view from the balcony. Not mixing yourself with the people, but staying from a different place. But also, after mass tourism, something that happened was that travelers went into the streets, went and mixed and mingled with the people, went to the plaza. So we see this in the case of O'Sullivan, and he realizes that he's facing a war of masks, that he is wearing a mask too, not only as a tourist, as a traveler, but also something that deals with his own identity. So he's questioning that. I think we're coming to the end. And then perhaps something that I find very interesting is when he comes back and he says, how can I tell the neighbors about this? I mean, how will they understand everything that I saw before when they are used to a different reality? So this is more or less the view that I wanted to share with you about this traveler who went to Mexico and Central America. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Leonel. And we're going to introduce now Professor Alberto Vitale, a researcher and teacher at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, our generous host. He's a specialist in Mexican literature, and also Professor Lizbeth Campos, a jurist with extensive experience in human rights and female migration. She is also a teacher at UNAM. Thank you for being here. Bienvenidos, welcome. And let's enter into this conversation with the view from the mountain that Leonel was telling us about.
Thank you very much. Good morning in New Zealand. Good afternoon in Mexico. I am grateful for the invitation to speak about Mexican literature and migration in this colloquium. Thank you very much, Alicia Giron, Vania, Leonel Alvarado, Celina, Bortolotto, and the others organizers of this important meeting. Lizbeth Campos, Nayeli Reyes, and I will summarize our research in a few slides. Next one. Mexico is an international corridor. We belong to a country that historically has received an expelled population in the last 5 centuries. Nowadays, thousands of migrants come from Central America to the United States, crossing more than 1,000 kilometers in Mexican territory. Next one, I will quickly mention some historical background in 3 stages and slides. In this map, we have Mesoamerica. In the next map, we have the kingdom of, or vice kingdom of the New Spain, you can see. And in the next map, we have independent Mexico with our historical highlights. Between 1836 and 1848, Mexico was dispossessed of Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and California by the United States of America. Mexico can be described as a dispossessed country. However, this is not a time for complaints, but for solutions. This reality should be an impulse to have more generous and logical migration policies in this century. Next one, Rulfo was born in 1917, exactly the year in which our current constitution was promulgated. Next. He studied very carefully our history in 3 main stages. He concluded that some patterns are repeated. For instance, the presence of a dominant and leading figure in the top of the power. Please retain these three concepts, cacique, encomendero, and of course, modern politicians. Next one, dispossession, despojo in Spanish, is a key word in Juan Rulfo's literature. Next, at the same time, many families reproduced and reproduce internally the patterns and models of domination imported from the outside. In other words, you can read this slide. This analogy in 2 levels of action is very important. In short, Rulfo's genius anticipates and describes the crisis of the patriarchal system inside of the families and outside of them, in the communities and societies. Next one. Juan Rulfo published 20 stories, 17 short stories for El Llano en Llamas, 53, 1 novel Pedro Páramo, 1955, 1 short novel or paper movie, El Gallo de Oro, and 1 short story, half fiction, half anthropological testimony, Castillo de Teayo. Pedro Páramo, the cacique, builds, leads, and finally destroys a totalitarian regime in many square kilometers of an imaginary region that in certain sense represents our whole Latin America. This is very important. Juan Rulfo's 20 plots, next one, and stories deal with the essential issues of our time. I list 12 major themes. All of them are present in Rulfo's work. Next. The short story Paso del Norte, migration is the main issue. In 1920, Juan Rulfo was 3 years old, and his father had to embark on the journey to Piedras Negras and Eagle Pass, more than 1,000 kilometers far from the native Sayula. In other words, Rulfo's family knew the trauma of the migration. Next one, the plot of Paso del Norte is quite simple. You can see very quickly, and I apologize for that, a young man to travel to the United States. He, as a son, takes a neighbor as a model. The father of the protagonist produces cohetes. Next one, you can see very quickly. Next. We have the 3 moments in the story. Next. These 3 moments are in fact 2. Then the journey to the border is told by the protagonist in the second discussion. Next, this Rulfo's narrative strategy reinforces the importance of telling a story and not just living it. Always telling a story combines telling of facts, arguments, and emotions and feelings. Next, the story indeed follows a sequence of memories, arguments, and feelings. You can see that in this slide. Next, by the way, the same pattern appears and is reproduced in the Border River scene the morning after the shooting. The Mexican policeman beats the injured protagonist. Next, I'll review one phrase as a sample, one phrase of the protagonist to his father. It is an example that he's trying to renew the affective relationship between father and son. Next, in this context, this phrase and another one were a key for Rulfo to synthesize the effort of a son to be psychologically recognized, accepted, and protected by his own father. Usted me nació is not a grammatically correct sentence. In Spanish, we say, you can see. Next, I've studied in three great Latin American poets, three different levels of aesthetic and successful use of grammatically incorrect sentences. In the past century, Vallejo, Borges, and Neruda have written poems in which some sentences are literally perfect and touching and memorable, not only despite, but because they break some grammatical rule and so produce an aesthetic effect. Next, with his great talent for condensing, Rulfo suggests that being a parent implies being born again. That's what the son is trying to express. Your responsibility as a father is so high and so inner that in the end, you are me and I am you, at least in the crucial moment of the birth. Next one, we have three possibilities. You can see them. Amazingly, these three possibilities are correct as interpretation of the original sentence and intention in the protagonist and of the very clever Rulfo's thinking and vision. Next one. In the second sentence, we can read in Spanish and in the American translation, Padre nos mataron, Father, they killed us. We don't have time to review this sentence, very rich in implications. Next one. In summary, we have the following elements in the short story. You can see 10 elements, 10 steps. Next one, all these elements appear in a testimonial migrant story. Armando Vela Sanchez published Crónicas de la Frontera in 2012. In this short story, he recounts his experiences just as he crossed the border several times between 1988 and 1998, 10 years. Next one, you can see here this very short contrastive review between Rulfo's fictional story and Vela's real testimonial story. Next one, and these are remarks about literary onomastics. Next, this is the real geography that Rulfo turns into dramatic and even tragic geography. Geographical names also appear scarcely in Rulfo's text, although it narrates the story of a long journey. Ojinaga, Las Tejas, and that is all. On the contrary, Vela's text is rich in anthroponyms and toponyms. This is normal because in a life story, the location in time and the location in space are crucial. Next one, finally, the most important difference between the no-named protagonist of Paso del Norte and Armando Vela Sanchez, author and protagonist, is that Rulfo's protagonist loses all identity and roots and therefore ends up as a transhuman rather than the migrant. Next one, ironically, Paso del Norte can be read as a sample of male home child care. The male is an old man. The mother's name is La Tránsito, the transit. This name reinforces the general situation of every character in this short story, Paso del Norte. All of them are in transit. On the contrary, the protagonist of Vela's book sometimes confuses his home in Mexico and his home in Los Angeles. He ends up having two strong belongings and identities, as well as a solid family. In his case, we have a reasonably happy ending, although he has witnessed several deaths and mistreatments, especially to women. And Lizbeth, you can go on.
Thank you, Doctor. The vision of migrant women. When we talk about migration, we rarely talk about women. However, female migration is a phenomenon that exists, despite being barely considered by national and international legislation. In recent years, women have gained autonomy as a subject of study. Before, they were considered as a companionship of the man, whether father, son, or husband. Today, women migrate by themselves for different reasons and under distinct conditions. It is interesting how the literature and the vision of a great author like Rulfo, almost like a mirror, describe what migrants experience in their path. A migrant woman most often withdraws from their life project to migrate, or migrate as part of her life project. The concept of life project is closely linked to fundamental principles such as freedom, dignity, and the existence of options that allow the development of what a person has proposed as a destiny. The life project addresses the integral realization of the affected person, considering their vocation, aptitudes, circumstances, potentialities, and aspirations, which allow to principles proposed as destiny. The life project addresses the integral realizations of affected persons, considering their vocation, which allow them to reasonably set certain expectations and access them. Security, for its part, will be the absence of disturbances that restrict or limit freedom beyond what is reasonable. Today, social relations are asymmetric and exclusion increasingly marked. This generates a lag in the development of a community and the age for spaces of violence that are already part of their own context. The absence of violence and development in a broad sense is equal to the satisfaction of basic human needs: survival, well-being, identity, and freedom for all. The current capitalist system that prevails around the world has brought positive consequences for some states and negative for others. Among the negatives, the incessant growth of inequality with regard to income distributions stands out, which causes abysmal differences in society and affect the lives of young people. The migrants always start from common ideals. Being a migrant generally has an economic and social causes of deficiencies and expectations. The kind of migrant will be shaped according to the actions taken to cross a strange country, far away, not only in territory, but many times beyond the geographical position, far from the identity of the person who migrates. I would like to contribute some narratives of migrant women, starting with one of the angles that are not always approached to, that of a migrant woman of science, recognizing that science touches the lives of every person on this planet, and these great women, who often from a very young age are forced to abandon their own countries, and within their families, roots, and customs, without looking back, following a dream which will also involve a great effort to maintain an academic position to achieve their goals. Being a migrant woman brings other difficulties that are not the same as those to which men are exposed to. A migrant woman, under any quality she does, is exposed to different dangers that simply because she's a woman is vulnerable to experience, as is the case of sexual violence and machismo. Throughout human history, migrants have played a fundamental role in the growth and the progress of nations. As we have said, they traveled seeking opportunities that were out of their reach in their homeland. In many cases, to escape the harsh reality that they live in their countries. Immigrant scientists have also received some of the highest prizes in science for their pioneering work. Since 2000, 40% of the Nobel Prizes won by Americans in chemistry, medicine, and physics. 31 of 78 awards have been obtained by immigrants, Forbes report. Segenet Kelemu grew up in a poor farming family in Ethiopia. Now is a molecular plant pathologist whose research is dedicated to helping to farmers grow more food and rise to the poverty. Kelemu was the first woman from her region to get a college degree. I think that once you give this big step, there will always be a part of your heart comparing everything and missing back home from time to time. In this text, we have decided to capture only some examples of the many women who decide to leave their place of origin and are successful in their journey contributing to the development of science. Perhaps we should think of a world where migrating was not the option to grow, where your own place of origin offered you the necessary opportunities to develop alongside the people you love and the place that gives you identity. The possibility has been raised that women and girls freely and determinedly choose to migrate for their countries of origin. However, we consider that this apparent free choice is nothing more than the mirage that responds to various factors compared to the null options that the state offers. Migrating is an act of courage and faith, where dreams are set on an uncertain path that many times does not have a good outcome, but ultimately trust in society itself and in a support network that must be built to cope with the distance charging. Thank you.
El micrófono, Celina.
I was saying thank you to everybody. Lizbeth, Professor Vital, Leonel, thank you very much. We have some minutes for questions. I have one to start, to get things rolling, as we say here in New Zealand. I was intrigued by what Leonel was saying about the Kiwi poet traveling in Central America and Mexico and adopting the hill view, right? The tourist view that sees things at a distance. And there was a work that I did on Leonel's poetry precisely with a Kiwi poet here, with an American immigrant here, contrasting the views of the immigrant and the expat. So my question is for all of you, for the three of you, these people who travel and are so sort of heart-wrenchingly depicted by Rulfo in a sort of, well, his own very pessimistic manner, but beautiful manner, creative with language and what happens with the dream? Because Lizbeth was listing, of course, the Nobel Prizes, people who end up successful, but that's not the story for everybody. So people cross, follow a dream. How does the story go on? it's not always successful. It's very, very hard to leave everything behind. There's a very high cost. So what happens when the view is not from the hill? When the view is from the plaza, from the barrio pobre of LA or Tucson or...
Leonel, would you like to begin?
Yes, well, in most cases, it ends in tragedy. That's unfortunate. That's what happens, for instance, to hundreds of thousands of Central Americans, because in order for them to get to the U.S., they have to cross Mexico, and cross the desert. For instance, I wrote a book about that. That is called Xibalbá, Texas. That deals with the idea that what immigrants find as they make their way up north, looking for that mythical north, is Xibalbá, is hell. No, Xibalbá in Mayan cosmogony is the underworld. No, hell is a Catholic concept, but it will be the closest thing. So that's what they find in most cases, and I also had experience of living in the U.S., in Barrio Latino, and seeing, when that experience doesn't end in tragedy, when people manage to get across and somehow make a living, find a job, we know that the circumstances are just harrowing, are just terrible. And on top of that, they have to support the economy of many countries back home. They have to keep sending money back to El Salvador, Honduras, and many places like that depend on that. That's why places like, it is said that places like El Salvador, Honduras, they export people. That's what they export. No, they don't export any other things, but people. So the experience is just incredible and really hard to believe. That's what happens, no? In the case of the traveler, during the colonial period, we saw that what prevailed is that view from the top. But then from the 19th century, we see, and this is interesting, we see, particularly with women travelers, there was a massive group a big group of women traveling to Latin America. They started going into the city, to the town, to the houses, and talking to people. And then there was the period of the social exploratrices, as it's called. They were visiting hospitals, and people. So that view changed. It was a different perspective. No, obviously, what the immigrant is looking at is completely different, and traveling for different reasons. No, that's a massive difference.
For me, it was very important to invite Lizbeth Campos to join me in this conference, because she has studied real women traveling along 2,000 kilometers from their country to the United States. And I would like to add, by the way, according to Leonel has just said, that Mexican migrants sent to Mexico last year more than 40 billion dollars. That is more or less 20 times the annual budget of our university, and we are a really big university. That means these two facts, real people traveling, and that's very important, trying to express to their existence, express that they exist, that they really exist, because several crimes are simply hidden, even by authorities. For this reason, for me, was very important to mention very quickly the scene in which the Mexican policemen mistreats the Mexican migrant after the North American policemen have mistreated him and killed his partner. So I think it's very important to remark this contrast between the economical importance of migrants' work every day and the mistreatment also every day. So, Lizbeth, I don't know if you want to add something.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor. Well, I think the dream is the expectation, and most of the times this expectation
there are many frustrations.
It's that give you the force to go on. Most of the times is precisely the dream that gives you the force to go on. I know that unfortunately not everyone has a good ending or a happy ending. And I think in that cases that are a lot of people that have to confront the harsh reality, the support of the society is the most important. The support the people who is around of that person that can't have the end that has in their own expectations, it's very, very important because we have an important paper in that moment. That it's the difference between go on or maybe could let you die in the worst cases.
I would summarize by telling that Rulfo's short story is a nightmare, and Bella's testimonial book has a relative happy ending, relatively.
Thank you both very much. Thank you, Leonel, too. Do we have any more questions or comments? We need to get ready for the next session. We're still talking about literature, so we're lucky. So if there are no more questions, thank you, everybody. Thank you for participating, for the interesting presentations.
Sorry, Celina, if we have 1 minute, I would like to know if this poet, Sullivan, has been enough translated in Spanish. I don't know him. It would be very interesting to know that.
Yes, I'm very happy to share the book with you. A few New Zealand poets have been translated into Spanish. He's one of them. Not this book. I think this book remains forgotten. No, I discovered this book because of the seminar that I teach on travel writing. So there are a few poets. I know somebody who's working on that. A few poems by Sullivan, and I'll be very happy to share them with you.
Thank you, Leonel.
Thank you very much.
So I think that's it for this panel. We've been very lucky.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Vanya will